Hello and welcome. My name is Judith Hawley and I'm the chair of the first of our new programme in the London Luminaries series. Now, we usually have a theme for each season, but this year our partners are deciding what they want to showcase, what they want to spotlight in their presentations. We'll also be running a London Luminaries live event at Orleans House Gallery on the 28th of May, and this will give you a chance to socialise with each other and with the speakers. Before I introduce you to tonight's speaker, let me remind you to type any questions you have into the chat at any point, either during the talk or in the Q&A afterwards, and I will raise them on your behalf at the end. I also want to send my sincere thanks to Chris and Rachel, but especially to Christine and Ricky for all their technical support tonight. Our speaker today, Howard Simmons, has spoken to us several times before and is always both informative and entertaining. He's a professional guide at Syon House and has made a significant contribution to the heritage of our region, from Heathrow to Chiswick House. He's talking to us tonight on the subject of Syon's role in the shaping of North America, the extraordinary contribution of Syon House and its inhabitants in the development of the United States and Canada. Over to you, Howard.
Thank you very much, Judith. And it's a delight to be here this evening and a chance to talk to you. And as you say tonight, my plan this evening is to take you through the extraordinary history of Syon House and the locality in the shaping of North America. It's interesting sometimes to think about the impact that a small locality can have in all sorts of other parts of the world. Just in case you don't know, this is Syon House, which is current home of the Duke of Northumberland, but was built in the Tudor period. It was constructed between 1547 and 1550, and as you can see here, it's a rather splendid building right on the banks of the River Thames and overlooking what's currently Kew Gardens, a World Heritage Site. So Syon itself was built by the Duke of Somerset, who was the Lord Protector to Henry VIII's young son, but it was basically sequestered from him by when he was tried for treason and executed and taken as a royal property. So it joined those held by the royal family. Queen Mary was the first queen regnant to have the house, and she passed it to the Bridgetine Order of Nuns. But when her half-sister Elizabeth became queen as a Protestant, she evicted the nuns and took the property as an adjunct to basically Richmond Palace just across the river. And as such, she used it as offices of state, and a number of councils of state were held there. And in fact, it was at Syon that some of the first discussions took place about the creation of a colony in the Americas, which was to become called Virginia. But at the time, of course, that wasn't known. And she was lobbied quite hard by a number of people about the opportunities for creating colonial growth. The view basically was that this would be good for trade, good from a strategic and military point of view, and for the adventurers who were pushing for it in particular, good from the opportunity for booty and plundering the ships of other colonial nations. This rather lovely picture of Elizabeth as a sort of middle-aged woman hangs at Syon, and I think it's a very interesting personal view of her, as opposed to the rather more formal view that we're used to, as you can see in this Hilliard portrait, of her as the ageless beauty in the extraordinary dresses. But Elizabeth is going to play a role in this, and through one of her favourites, Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh had fairly humble beginnings, and became a soldier fighting against the Spanish in the continent. And then with his half-brother, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, he went on expeditions to the Americas, to the New World, and became absolutely convinced that Britain should be having colonial expansion. And when he came to the notice of Queen Elizabeth in 1580s for his military role in Ireland and suppressing the rebels there, she brought him to court, and he rapidly became one of her chief favourites. He was given lots of key positions. He was made, for example, captain of the Royal Guard, and he had a lot of unlimited access to Elizabeth. And he certainly spoke with her a number of times at Syon House about the concept of colonial expansion. His half-brother died in 1583, and he'd been given letters of marque from the Queen to explore the Americas. and Raleigh had been with him to look at the coastline of America on a couple of occasions. And at that stage, he pushed the Queen to appoint him to that role. And she said he could take that on, and he could organize expeditions, but he was too important to go on himself. And it was on the condition that he stayed close to her at court, which he did. He funded a number of important expeditions, one that came back having mapped the coastline, another that brought back some actual Native Americans, much to the interest of London and the court. And the opportunities for wealth through trade were clearly there. He also brought his steward into the frame. Now, Thomas Harriot is probably one of the most significant scientists you've possibly not heard much about. He was a complete polymath. He is probably the founder of the English School of Algebra. He was the creator of maritime tables for navigation. He basically studied languages and he studied the sciences. He was a close personal friend and servant to Raleigh, and Raleigh appointed him as steward of his estates in Ireland, very significant estates, which Elizabeth had given him in gratitude for his military role. And he went on two of the expeditions to the coast of America, making very detailed maps of the coastline and details of the flora, the fauna, the peoples there. He studied their languages, which of course were not written, but he made a phonetic study of the Algonquin language, and so that early explorers could communicate more easily with Native American peoples. He is to play a significant role, together with a painter, John White, who went with him. So White brought back these beautiful illustrations of the life as it was being lived in a very natural way amongst native peoples of First Nations in the Americas. This is in the area that has come to be known as Virginia, but of course it wasn't called that at the time. And this showing a township and the sort of settlements and the way the houses were constructed, and timber bark, and the fencing to protect the palisade, to protect the camp, and so on and so forth. And studies of actual Native Indian people, Native American people, showing the costumes, showing the sort of tattoo marks, and so on and so forth. And they did this across the whole of their study. When they returned effectively, they produced a very splendid publication, a brief and true report of the Newfound Land of Virginia, in which these marvelous illustrations were shown. And this was to promote not only scientific interest in the New World, but also to promote the idea of developing a colony. And in 1586, basically, Elizabeth was persuaded to knight Walter Raleigh, so he became Sir Walter Raleigh, and she appointed him as governor and lord of Virginia. And there's this rather splendid woodcut you can see here from 1596, where Elizabeth is referred to as Queen of England, France, Scotland, and Virginia. So you can see Virginia is starting, the colony being named after her as the Virgin Queen, of course, starting to take on quite a key role. And this is all from the discussions and the lobbying that went on initially at Zion. It was actually a major council of state held at Greenwich Palace that formalized this, but I think Zion's role as a precursor is a very important one. We then moved to Henry Percy, because Elizabeth had decided to rent the property at Syon House to the 9th Earl of Northumberland. And he, of course, was another great polymath. He was very interested in the arts, a sponsor of Donne and artists and poets, and the sciences. In this painting, he is shown as the Chancellor of Cambridge University. And he was very interested in what Raleigh was doing. He was also very interested in Harriet and became a close personal friend of Harriet. In fact, he paid for Harriet to move into an outbuilding at Syon House and to create an observatory there so that he could pursue his interest in astronomy. And this was quite interesting. This is the house at the time of Harriet's residency. He was in a property just to the left of this picture, which is where he lived and basically built his observatory. And from there, he was able to do some of the first illustrations of the moon. He set up his telescopes there. And also, he looked at the sunspots. These were drawings made from Zion. Some of the first studies that had been done, and he was able to calculate the rotation of the sun. And he lived at Zion for a good few years, basically, and continued to be an active agent in promoting the idea of the colonial expansion and the studies of the Third World. Now, when Elizabeth dies, James of Scotland comes to the throne, rather ironic as the son of one of Elizabeth's great rivals, the Mary Queen of Scots. But he becomes James I of England, of course, James VI of Scotland. He is also interested in the whole issue of colonial expansion and is persuaded to effectively support the creation of a new joint stock company for Virginia. Raleigh, I'm afraid, has fallen from favour and in fact has been accused of plotting to assassinate James and ended up in the Tower, where he spends the next 12 years writing his 5 volumes on the history of the world. But James creates the joint stock company, and coming back to the Percys and Syon House, they are key investors in that company. And in fact, you can see here the coastline of America, and it's interesting because this shows the range of First Nations, Native American tribes that were living in the area. And it's important, I think, when we talk about explorers who discover a country, that normally there are people there already living there, and there's an impact on that existing civilization from that's about to come in. But the area that we're talking about here, where Virginia was, just to show that this area here and the Powhatan First Nations people are the most important tribes in that area. So in 1607, they send out the first grouping of settlers to create the town of Jamestown, named after the king, on the River James, named after the king, and the entrance to that river being protected by 2 basically bluffs of cliffs, one named Cape Henry, after the king's eldest son, and one named Cape Charles, after the king's second son. So you can see quite a lot of engagement from the royal family and quite a lot of support from the settlers seeking further royal patronage. Smith is a soldier, and they think that he is a suitable leader, but I'm afraid he's something of a self-publicist and quite an egoist, and there's a lot of tension in a very short space of time. This shows the promotion of the colony. Basically, already the idea that Virginia is a new Eden, that there are all fantastic opportunities there, and that there are all sorts of gains to be gathered, and trying to encourage people both to invest and to take part in the colonization. George Percy, the younger brother of the Earl, is basically one of the first settlers to go, and is the deputy governor of the colony. And he does not get on with John Smith. One of the interesting things that George Percy does is to keep a very interesting study, a log of the whole experience of the settlers, the voyage across, settling in, building the buildings, and so on and so forth. And it's a fascinating, detailed study. It also picks up very much on the political tensions, small p, political tensions, and the interpersonal tensions. And he's an outspoken critic of John Smith as the governor. Smith is actually injured in a gunpowder explosion in 1609 and returns to England. And in 1609, George becomes the governor and the lead figure in the new colony. Now it's a difficult and trying time because they're settling in, or trying to settle in, with a new environment. They're not terribly well equipped from the point of view of agriculture, and they're heavily dependent on the local First Nations people for support, advice. And the Powhatan people are very supportive and very generous. They help the settlers, they help the settlers with the building, they help the settlers with their crops. But there comes a time when that turns into a tension, largely because with a subsistence economy, if you've got people who are constantly making demands on you, it's really unsettling for the host community. And so that tension turns into, I'm afraid, actual warfare. I just point this out because this is a significant thing. This is an indenture document. All of the labour initially in Virginia is indentured white labour from Britain and Europe. There are no slaves at this stage, and there's not the colour and racist bars that appear later on. You signed up an indenture for 7 years. You might be a criminal who's been sent across for 7 years. You might be a volunteer, but between 3 and 7 years, and at the end of that, you could then settle with some land in the colony. So it's a way of both attracting new settlers into the land, the promise of having land when you've served your time as a labourer. But it's important because, as we'll come on to it, things change a little later. And this is quite an interesting picture of John White showing the English arriving present-day North Carolina. It says North Carolina. This is actually part of what was then Virginia. It becomes North Carolina later on. And so that's the change there. This brings us on to Pocahontas, a fantastic figure, and thanks to Walt Disney, probably known internationally in all sorts of ways. But that's a very romanticized story. I mean, Pocahontas was a real person and a very interesting, very determined young woman. She was not a princess. That's a title that she was given by European peoples, but she was the daughter of a powerful chieftain in the Powhatan Confederacy. And she was effectively taken as a hostage by the English settlers as a sort of trading ship. And while she was held a prisoner, she converted to Christianity, and she married a young English settler. This is a chap called John Rolfe. Now, he'd come across with his wife and daughter, but sadly they had died on the journey over, so he was then a widower. He met Pocahontas in 1614, and they married, and they had a son, Thomas, and they became something of a prominent couple, one of the first interracial marriages, and holding up the prospects of what settled Virginia would be like in the longer term. And the colony determined to send them both back to England as a publicity and promotional thing to show the positive aspects of Virginia. I should say Rolfe is a very key figure because he brings a new breed of tobacco to be planted in Virginia, which is a much sweeter tobacco. It's quite a critic, the first batch they have, and this becomes very popular, and the tobacco trade starts to take off in quite a significant format. When Pocahontas comes to England, she's feted. She's something of a celebrity. She and her husband land at Plymouth. They travel up to London, and everywhere they go, they're mobbed by vast crowds. She's introduced to the King and Queen. They attend a masque at the Whitehall Palace in the banqueting house, and she becomes a particular friend of the Queen, Queen Anne of Denmark, who goes to the theatre on a number of occasions with her and comes down to Zion to visit Pocahontas. I should say that Pocahontas and her husband stay at Zion, not in the house itself, but in a property in the grounds for about 6 months while they're in England. And that's a base, so another significant element. And at the end of this talk, I'll just refer back to Pocahontas and her time at Zion. So we move on from there in the sort of 1614, 1615. Sadly, Pocahontas, I should say, dies on the way back to America. She sets sail from London, but dies on the River Thames and is buried at Gravesend. Unfortunately, her grave's since been destroyed, and we have no idea where it exactly is, but there is a rather lovely statue that's been erected in the churchyard where we know she was buried. So moving on to the 1640s, and this young German gentleman crops up, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, nephew of King Charles I, son of his older sister, Elizabeth, who's married the Elector of Bohemia and gone to live in Germany. And when the Civil War breaks out in 1642, he comes to England to offer his services to his uncle, the king. He is an experienced soldier. He's taken part in the 30 Years' War in Europe, and is known as something of a pretty impressive cavalry leader. And he ends up being general of the Royalist horse. But in 1642, he leads the assault on Brentford by the king. The king has left London, and this is his opportunity to recapture the capital city in 1642 after the Battle of Edgehill. He moves his army in. Rupert leads the advance guard. They attack Brentford. His troops occupy and fortify Zion, and Zion is later fired on from the river by parliamentarian vessels and is damaged in the course. Rupert unfortunately goes on to sack Brentford, which is a very damaging thing from the king's point of view. But that's him as a young man. Now let's just see where things go. Run through the Civil War and the Restoration in 1660. Charles II, Charles I's eldest son, is now king, and Prince Rupert is back. Rupert, I should say, when he leaves England, serves as a general at sea or admiral of the fleet for the Royalists. And when in 1660 Charles II is restored, he is made Lord High Admiral for the English Navy and basically Warden of Windsor Castle and various other honours that he holds. He's a member of the Royal Society and is also keenly interested, backed on his naval experience, on the possibilities of expanding colonial settlement. And he's very much aware that there's a lot of competition. I mean, what's happening is, if you look at the Americas at this time, you've got colonies set up from Sweden, from Holland, from France, from Spain, and just the one little settlement of Virginia. Now, back in Europe, we are being worsted by the Dutch in naval warfare. And there's a desire to try and, if you like, respond against the Dutch. And Rupert comes to Zion at a meeting where Charles is present. I should say Charles has come to see the Earl to discuss the recovery of his father's art collection, which was sold off during the Civil War period. And as a sort of rather cheeky thing, asked the Earl to lead the work on getting those pictures back, knowing that the Earl himself had acquired a number. But there we are, that's his sense of humour. And he was just coming to check on this, and Rupert came across to say, look, I think I've got a pretty good idea about how we can actually attack the Dutch, but not in Europe, in the colonies. There's an opportunity to essentially put one over on the Dutch and possibly really advance our own interests in the New World. A rather lovely picture of King Charles II, and just to envisage as he might have looked at Zion when he was having these discussions. And this is showing the map of the Americas at the time. And you can see you've got New France up here, New Holland is here, New England, which is just the Virginia bit, is down here. And then further south, you've got the Spanish interests and so on and so forth. Basically, what his suggestion is that they can make a surprise attack on the Dutch-held colonies, the New Holland, which they do. So 5 vessels enter the great port of New Amsterdam and basically demand that the governor surrenders New Holland to the English. Stuyvesant is the governor. He thinks about resistance but knows it's pretty futile because he's outgunned and outnumbered, and so surrenders. So New Holland basically falls to England and is renamed New England as a whole. And New Amsterdam, the major port, is renamed New York after the Duke of York, Charles II's brother. The other major thing that Rupert is significant for is the fact that he also suggested to the king the acquisition of more land, more territory in the North America. And in that instance, his proposal was that there should be a trading company established to exploit the animal pelts and other wealth that he could see in what is today Canada. And this led to the creation of a company called the Hudson Bay Company, trading company, which Rupert was appointed as the first governor, and the creation of, if you like, at arm's length from the English crown, but at the behest of the English crown, a new expansion into Canada of what's called Prince Rupert's Land. And it actually stays at Prince Rupert's Land right up to the 1870s, when it's absorbed into the Dominion of Canada as such. Now, it sounds small, but should just say that Prince Rupert's Land is 1.5 million square miles of territory. It doubles the size of English interests in Canada, and it's half of what is modern day Canada as such. So it's a huge expansion of English interests in North America, and again comes from discussions which were really from the earlier origins in those held at Syon House. I move on now to a later period where Hugh Smithson has married Elizabeth Percy and become the first Duke of Northumberland in 1766, and again is a patron of the arts. And his son, he has two sons. His first son is basically appointed as he's a military man. He serves in Europe, and he is then appointed to serve in North America. And this is in the 1770s, when there's major tension, which has basically sprung out. And basically he's sent across to Boston to help to pacify the urban and unrest that's arising. This is the no taxation without representation argument, which will spill over into becoming the full-fledged American Revolution. He's there when this actually opens up, because a detachment of the English army is sent to destroy weapons that have been accumulated at a small town called Concord, and they march via a small village called Lexington. The militia at Lexington are called out and try and stop the British regulars from marching through. It leads to an exchange of gunfire. Still to this day, we're not sure who opened fire first, but it doesn't matter. Obviously, this outnumbered militia have very limited impact on the British regulars, which with disciplined volleys do kill a significant number of the militia. This is the shot that's heard around the world and leads to the open warfare. That British detachment goes on to destroy the weapons at Concord and then starts to march back to Boston. But all the way back, it is dogged by the Americans and takes very significant casualties. As a consequence, the retreat almost becomes the rout. Percy is sent out to halt that rout and to basically make sure that the British troops are given cover. He deploys his artillery extremely well, holds the Americans back, and does turn what could have been a total disaster into a structured retreat. So that's his first actual experience of warfare there. But he goes on to fight quite successfully in the capture of New York and the capture of Fort Washington. So he's quite a significant and effective general in North America at this time. But his other significant role is to create alliances with the Native American tribes, because what they want to do is keep them on side, working with Britain and not to side with the colonists. And he develops close links with a number. So here he is. This is him at an early age, when he was basically Lord Warkworth before he became Duke, when his father died. And he became a very close personal friend of Joseph Brant. Now, Brant was a significant member of the Mohawk tribe, which used to be called part of the Iroquois Confederacy. That's 9 tribes in Upper New York State. But in fact, they prefer to be called today the Haudenosaunee people rather than Iroquois Confederacy. And he had served in the earlier French and Indian Wars for Britain and had a distinguished record. And he becomes a friend of the Duke, and actually visits England and stays at Syon House on a number of occasions. He comes across, firstly, to secure the interests of the Indian people, and secondly, when the war is concluded and England basically loses and has to evacuate, to try and ensure that his peoples and First Nations people are treated fairly. This picture is one that was commissioned, in fact, by the Duke, and this still hangs at Syon House. It's a rather splendid portrait of Brant, and he's one of those figures. I think the Americans regard him as a terrorist because of the actions he took in Upper New York State, attacking American settlements, and we regard him very much as a hero. So one man's hero is another man's enemy, or freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, as I say. Note there's a rather splendid gorget around his neck. This is a badge of rank. And this was actually given to him by the king when he was made a captain in the British Army. And this is still in existence, and is actually on show in the Joseph Brant Museum in Burlington, Ontario, in Canada. And that's a small museum, but very much worth seeing. And this gives you a sense of what the native allies were wearing during the war. using trade guns, interestingly, largely sold by the Hudson Bay Company as they went forward. So you can see how the arms industry actually had spin-offs even in those days, essentially. And the final rather romantic picture by Gilbert Stuart, which is at the British Museum. And note the military gorget replaced here by a natural seashell. As I say, the friendship between the Duke and Brant goes on over a number of years, until Brant's death, in fact, in 1807. And if you visit the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, there's a splendid gallery devoted to that friendship, to their exchange of correspondence. And as an example, there's a rather splendid pair of silver pistols, very expensive pistols, that the Duke had commissioned, made at Doon in Scotland, and gave to Brant as a gift. So you can see it was quite an important relationship that they had. Now, the second Duke, and here he is as an older man. You saw him as a younger man. He's an older man now, and he's also straddles another range of native peoples' relationships, because he becomes a friend also of John Norton. Now, Norton is a nephew of Brant. He, in fact, is of mixed heritage. A Scottish father and a Greek mother, but in native people's attitude, the matrilineal line was important. So it was a relationship with them through the descent of the mother that was important. He goes back to Scotland with his father for a brief period of time, and then returns to North America, where he joins the British Indian Department out of Fort Niagara. And it's while he is sent across to England by Brant to lobby on behalf of the interests of First Nations people that he gets to know the Duke, stays again at Syon House on a number of occasions. And he, in 1808, actually goes on an expedition where he travels the entire 800-mile length of the Ohio River and writes up the study of the flora, the fauna, all of that, and dedicates that book as a gift to the second Duke. And it's still in the library, in fact. And interestingly, the book is still in print. And it's a fascinating study of early days. I should also say it was, in fact, in his role as a member of the British Indian Department, it wasn't just a sort of a naturalist interest. It was a military investigation in terms of how prepared the Americans were militarily and what their defense structures were like. And he straddles into the War of 1812. So essentially in 1812, where Britain is heavily involved in the Napoleonic Wars and a major struggle that is sort of worldwide in essence, America declares war on England and tries to invade Canada. The Americans, a war party had developed where essentially they took great exception to the fact that British ships stopped American ships at sea, searched them, took sailors off to supplement the crews on British ships, and generally interfered. And so under the title of free trade and sailors' rights, quite a lot of antagonism was developed. And the view was taken that, in fact, it would be good to invade Canada and occupy it, because the Britons were up to no good. This is a bit of political propaganda, American-based, showing the fact that they were paying native peoples to effectively scalp Americans. This is not actually true, but I mean, this is the way that it was being portrayed and whipping up, if you like, prejudice. And so effectively, war breaks out. Now, the Americans miscalculated. President Madison, who said, we can take Canada with a corporal's guard of 3 men, because they didn't expect there to be much resistance. There were very few regular troops in Canada, because we were busy fighting Napoleon in Europe and across the rest of the world. And so they had a militia, and they didn't expect the militia to put up much of a show. And they thought that the larger Francophone population would also not be particularly supportive. So they anticipated that by pushing across the border, they would be able to occupy Canada and take it, quite simply. Huge miscalculation, because basically what happened was that a large number of the Native American peoples who lost their territories through the American War of Independence had moved up along the border, and a large number of loyalists who'd also been dispossessed of the American Revolution had been resettled in Canada all the way along this frontier place. So when they tried to cross, they hit probably the section of the population felt most strongly anti-American. And so there was huge resistance. And the Americans, in fact, initially suffered major defeats. And Norton, who we were talking about earlier, played a major role in that. He was involved in virtually every combat that took place along this length, but also along this particular bit, along the Niagara, from Fort Niagara, old Fort Niagara, right the way down to Buffalo down here in New York State. And you can see the battle sites along there. He led a mixed force of free men of color. I should say that a large number of slaves had escaped from the Americas and come up to Canada, where they were given freedom. And they thought if the Americans came in and occupied, they would probably be forced back into slavery. So they resisted. A large number of the Native American peoples who had already lost their lands once and weren't going to lose them again. And then, in fact, the Canadian militia did play quite a blinder and fought extremely well, and held the Americans on most of the battlefronts. This rather splendid picture of Norton was commissioned by the Duke and hangs today at Syon House. And interestingly, the Canadian Post Office actually took this and turned it into a postage stamp in 2012 as part of the commemorations of the War of 1812, because they felt it defined Canadian independence and Canadian difference from the USA. And here is an example of what is called free men of colour who fought again for Britain against the American invaders. Now, Britain hit back in 1814 because Napoleon was captured for the first time and went into exile, and it freed up troops from Europe. And we sent an expeditionary force across the Americas. That force, under Rear Admiral Cockburn here, landed on the East Coast, marched inland, occupied Washington, and burnt not Washington as such, not the civilian population, but burnt down all of the major state buildings, the naval yards, the offices, and specifically the President's House or President's Mansion. This picture, which is from the archives in the White House, actually shows the building after it had been fired by the British troops. Pretty sad state. And it took 5 years to renovate it and bring it back into use. And as I say, it is now known as the White House because of that major cleansing operation, and is a splendid building. We see a lot of it on television at the moment, of course. But it's just interesting to see that little bit of revenge that was meted out to the Americans. Very few people talk about the War of 1812, but it did happen. It's the first and only time that a major American city has been occupied by the enemy and significant destruction hit upon it. And the second thing that the British did was they tried to capture the port of Baltimore. That was not successful, largely because of the heroic resistance of Fort McHenry, which you can see in this picture here, with the British Navy out here firing their bombs inside. They also fired a number of rockets, and that led to, I should say, this is the flag that flew from the roof of the fort right the way through the battle. It's a massive banner. It's about sort of 40 feet by 40 feet, huge, and is today, as you can see, in the Smithsonian. But essentially, the fact that the flag was still flying the next morning after the naval bombardment gave great encouragement. And the Francis Scott wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, which has become effectively the American national anthem, to the tune of an English drinking song, which it is said originated in pubs in the London area and in Middlesex, and it's suggested that it may actually have been the Apprentice, London Apprentice, that this came from. So another connection with the Isleworth and Zion area. We move on quickly to John Quincy Adams. He was the American ambassador to, in turn, Portugal, Prussia, and Russia. And he was appointed to take part in the peace negotiations, which lasted for 6 months in Ghent, in Belgium. And you can see his signature here. He became later on the 6th president of the United States, but he was appointed also as minister to England, and spent a time at Brentford, and regularly visited Syon House when he spent his 2 years as a tenant. Now this takes us back to the second son of the first Duke of Northumberland, and this is James Smithson. Now James was a love child, so not a legitimate offspring, and was originally named after his mother and given a French name, so Jacques Louis Macy. but he chose to take his father's name, Smithson, and was very proud of that. He became a very significant scientist, mineralogist and geologist. He never married, never had any children, but he developed quite a significant fortune of his own. Spent most of his time in Europe and lived in Italy. And when he died, he left all of his money on the condition that it be used to fund an institute for learning in Washington, in America, to be named after him, or the Smithsonian Institute. And so a local man is actually responsible for one of the most prestigious and largest museum and research establishments in the world. He was originally buried in Italy, but his body was brought and then put into a special crypt in the basement of this major and the oldest building of the Smithsonian Institute, the Castle Building. And then that just shows you the National Mall with the buildings of the Smithsonian. There are some 19 museums and 12 research institutes scattered all the way along. All these major buildings in the front of here are museums of the Smithsonian. And you can see that, just a massive, massive area. It has something like 136 million artifacts on display and receives about 58 million physical visitors, as well as many million more coming online. Quite an extraordinary achievement. And just to finish, I said I'd mention, so by the time all of that has happened, this is the Americas, this is the United States. It is still constrained. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 is purchased from France, which doubles the size of the United States. And in 1847, they will expect to go to war with Mexico and take that land. And so you can see America, 3/3 of America, moving from the Atlantic to the Pacific in that period. And just to finish off, I mentioned the Pocahontas. In 2016, a number of the First Nations chieftains from the Powhatan tribe came to Zion. This is the Duke of Gloucester, who is representing the Queen, coming by carriage with them to attend the building. And the ceremony took part inside. A lot of local schools were involved, a lot of local people. And you can see here some of the chieftains about to unveil the memorial to Pocahontas, which is on the wall of the estate, just opposite where she stayed. Significant part about this is, just to bring it right up to date, is they had been fighting a long battle for reparation, and it had gone through the American judicial system, but needed to be signed off by the president. In 2016, the president was one Donald Trump, and they weren't terribly optimistic about him actually signing off on this. However, a batch of documents were put together from this ceremony in Zion and sent across to Trump. And you may or may not know, but he's quite taken with the royal family. He's certainly smitten with the Queen, and he was very touched by this, and he did indeed sign the legal documentation. And we got a great thank you from Powhatan chieftains. And so even today, in the 2016, Zion is having an effect on American politics and American life.
Thank you so much, Howard, for that extraordinary, I mean, I always say extraordinary talk and wonderful talk and so on, but it really was amazingly rich. And we'll pick up some questions in a moment. I've already seen some coming into the chat, and do put in some more as we speak. But before Howard takes down this final slide, I just want to advertise to you the rest of the series. We meet mostly on the first Thursday of each month, with some months off during the Easter and summer holidays. But do tune in again for our next talk, which is on the 1st of May, and it will be a new speaker from Turner's House. Turner's House is one of our original Luminous partners, and it'll be commemorating the anniversary, JMW Turner at 250. I want to end with a terrific thanks to you, Howard, for researching this. I mean, it is really your discovery that has put this story together, and also for presenting it to us in such a lucid way, which I think gives us all lots more to think about and lots more to follow up on. So thank you, Howard, and I'm sure the audience will join with me in thanking you. And thank you to our audience, and do come back and see us again when we introduce Turner's House and thinking about Turner 250. Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.